Actually, studying Oskar Rescher was not easy. I received support from many people and institutions. First of all, I would like to thank them, but I will not count their names here one by one. Then let's proceed with the question why I'm interested in Oskar Rescher. I'd like to first start with this information. I heard about Rescher's name from my doctoral advisor, Professor Orhan Bilgin. He would occasionally tell anecdotes about Rescher during class. This stuck with me. However, Rescher wasn't the one on whom I was focused. I saw a manuscript in the online database of Leipzig University Library in 2017. You can see it in the slide. And it was a digital copy, a Turkish verse translation of Attar's Mantıkut Tayr, prepared by Fedai Mehmet Dede. According to the colophon, it was an autograph. While I was examining the manuscript, however, the text you see in the slide caught my attention. This note on the inner cover was understood to have been written by someone European. I first asked the librarians how likely it was to put such a note by a librarian. They said it wasn't very likely. At the time, I thought that this note belonged to the person who provided the manuscript to the library. The note was written in German, which tells that the copy is an autograph of Dervish Fedai's translation of Mantıkut Tayr and the date. This information agreed with the colophon. According to Abdülbaki Gölpınarlı, the work was the only complete verse translation of Mantıkut Tayr in Turkish. Fedai was a Mevlevi dervish who lived in Tripoli. If this manuscript is an autograph, it's valuable. What really interested me, however, was that the Western person who wrote this down knew about it. I was curious as to how this copy, a possible autograph, had gotten to Leipzig. And the research process began for me. This note opened the door to many questions, much research, and many publications and discoveries that have gone on since 2017, and the process still continues, actually. Shortly after, I received the answer. According to the information on the DFG project website, the manuscripts that begin with the shelf numbers code Arab, code Pers, and code Turk were received from Oskar Rescher. Therefore, the manuscript listed under shelf number code Turk 84 was one of the manuscripts Rescher had sold to the library. Then this question came to mind. If this note was Rescher's, and if Rescher sold this manuscript to Leipzig, knowing it was an autograph, I wondered to what other places Rescher was selling. While busying myself with this question, I heard that a manuscript seminar was to occur in Berlin in March 2019. I applied to it because I learned that Berlin had some things related to Rescher. On one hand, I would attend the seminar, while on the other hand, I was going to obtain some information on this topic. My application was accepted and I went to Berlin. Berlin actually had a collection of 1,722 manuscripts that had been sold there after Rescher's death, a rather large collection. It was sold in 1974. It was the collection I wanted to see. For years, this collection was casting a shadow over the information about the manuscripts Rescher had sold to the Berlin State Library. A lady, Ayla König, who was closest to Rescher, contacted Berlin after his death and wanted to sell a large collection to the library that she declared to be Rescher's personal library. But as the Arabic manuscripts were being catalogued, some researchers had doubts, for the collection was very ordinary. I examined all of these in Turkish and created identification slips, and I couldn't find the slightest trace of Rescher among these manuscripts. According to a letter from that lady, from Ayla König, to the US dated 1971, Rescher had no manuscripts left in 1971. Rescher was very ill at the time and passed away a short time later. In other words, this collection is unlikely the body of Rescher's personal library. According to me, the manuscripts in this collection have nothing to do with Rescher. That's why I call this collection the so-called Rescher collection. Meanwhile, Rescher had been an active manuscript supplier for the Berlin State Library between 1913 and 1936. I will get into the details in a moment, but when I wanted to examine this so-called collection, my dear friend Christoph guided me to some completely different things. Something emerged that had not been previously detected, and the dimensions of which were unknown to the library officials at the time. Rescher had gradually sold 1,192 manuscripts to the library over 23 years, between 1913 and 36. He had made the sales by mail. I've created and published a list of these manuscripts by examining the library's acquisition journals, by scanning the catalogs, by using the identification slips I'd prepared, and by laying eyes on all the manuscripts that had been obtained through Rescher in the library. In the meantime, I set out to determine which other libraries had Rescher manuscripts. As my studies on Rescher moved forward, a phrase settled on my tongue for covering the manuscripts Rescher had sold: Rescher manuscripts. I think this phrase should be included in the literature. According to my current findings, many libraries have manuscripts in their collections that were sold by Rescher. For example, thousands of manuscripts purchased from Rescher, mostly in Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, are found in the British Library, Cambridge University Library, the Bodleian Libraries of Oxford University, Uppsala University Library, Basel University Library, Wrocław University Library, Poland, Yale University Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, the University of California Libraries, Vatican Apostolic Library, National Library of the Czech Republic, Austrian National Library, and the libraries in Berlin, Leipzig, Hamburg, Munich, Heidelberg, Göttingen, and Halle Saale. New ones may also possibly be added to these libraries. Let us see the details of the Rescher manuscripts in the Berlin State Library. He sent 8 manuscripts to the library between 1913 and 14. And from the establishment of the library's Oriental department in 1919 until 1936, Rescher supplied 1,184 Oriental manuscripts to the department, more than any other bookseller at the time, I mean to the Berlin State Library. His commercial relationship with the library started in 1913, gained momentum after 1924, and ended in 1936. I published the details and the list as an article. Let's give numbers from a few more libraries. Rescher sold 110 Islamic manuscripts to Breslau University Library between 1924 and 32. And Rescher procured the entry of a total of 245 Islamic manuscripts into the National Library of the Czech Republic between 1926 and 46. In my opinion, the most modest group among the manuscripts Rescher sold to Berlin, Leipzig, Wrocław, the Vatican, Prague, and Vienna are the ones in Prague. I think the most important reason for this was the limited budget opportunities the library had at the time. I also published this as an article. Rescher sold 262 manuscripts to Leipzig University Library between 1925 and 34. As with other libraries, Rescher mostly sent manuscripts to Leipzig by mail. The proposed manuscripts were assessed by 2 experts. We published this list with my dear friend Beate Wiesmüller. In those same years, Rescher had sold 374 manuscripts to the Vatican Apostolic Library and around 500 to the Austrian National Library. While I don't know the total number yet, I can say that it's in the thousands. I assume I've been able to answer the question of why Oskar Rescher. And then let's ask a new question. Who is this Oskar Rescher? His grandfather, Nehemias Rescher, was a physician, and his father, Adolf, was a merchant. Born in 1883, Rescher graduated from gymnasium in Stuttgart in 1902, and there he learned Greek, Latin, and French. After completing his military service, he began his law studies in Munich. However, he unenrolled in 1904. He began studying Oriental languages at the Faculty of Philology in Berlin. He received his philology diploma in 1908 and received his doctoral degree in 1909. Then he attended Leipzig University in 1909 and 1910. There he took Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian classes, alongside Persian and Old Persian classes, while improving his knowledge of Arabic through the New Arabic and Middle Arabic classes. Rescher joined the DMG in 1909, and his articles began to appear in Zeitschrift der DMG, the leading journal of the era. He had conducted visits to Istanbul during this time. During these travels, he examined manuscripts in Istanbul and Bursa, making and publishing studies on this subject. Having made a rapid entry into the academic community, Rescher started to publish articles in many journals and to publish one by one books he prepared in Istanbul, in particular by being fed from both manuscripts and from İsmail Sahip Efendi. This period, in which Rescher developed himself through the Hoca-student and even friendly relations under the protection of Sahip Efendi in Istanbul, and in which he prepared works for publication, ended with the outbreak of World War I. He had been drafted into the military while in Istanbul and needed to move to the place of duty within 24 hours. Rescher was a letter censor in the Halbmondlager prison camp in Wunsdorf near Berlin. On May 1st, 1919, Rescher defended his habilitation thesis at Breslau University and obtained his venia legendi. He later gave more than 20 courses at the Faculty of Philosophy there in Oriental languages, including Arabic, Turkish, and Syriac, and classified the Oriental manuscripts in the library. Rescher had resided in the city of Breslau from 1919 to 1924 and received long-term permission to be in Istanbul as of 1924. The fact that Rescher started to trade manuscripts intensely as soon as he arrived in Istanbul suggests that he had planned to collect manuscripts from Istanbul and send them abroad while still in Breslau. Rescher was awarded the title of professor on May 11, 1925, and he continued his contact with the institution until 1933, when his venia legendi privilege was stripped away due to a decision of the Nazi regime. Rescher applied for receiving Turkish citizenship due to his prolonged residency and became a Turkish citizen in 1937. Rescher apparently spent his last years struggling with illnesses and died in 1972. My dear friend Dr. Torf Hanstein and I have created a biography of Rescher using the information we compiled from manuscripts, memoirs, books, publications, interviews, and institutions where he worked. The findings we have arrived at have shown us that Rescher worked as a librarian for almost 50 years. He worked at Breslau University's library, Süleymaniye Library, Istanbul University's Institute of Islamic Studies Library, Topkapı Palace Museum Library, and Istanbul University Manuscripts Library, as well as the libraries of Ankara University and Istanbul Archaeological Museum. In addition to knowing Arabic, Turkish, Persian, Hebrew, and Syriac, his knowledge of German, English, French, Italian, Danish, Dutch, Russian, Greek, and Latin paved the way for his employment in the libraries in Turkey. Some points in Rescher's life could and probably will never be completely clarified. He was too secretive as a person. Too little was known about him, even by his contemporaries and colleagues. He lived in turbulent times, experiencing 2 world wars, hyperinflation and the Great Depression, the end of the Ottoman Empire, and the development of modern Turkey. We believe that Rescher was passionate about printed and written materials. The manuscript and printed book trade should also be a manifestation of this passion. Thanks to this, he saw and examined many more books and gained knowledge. Then there's a new question. Why Rescher started selling manuscripts found in Turkey? Again, there is another question. As someone who took Turkish cultural assets outside of the country, is Rescher a traitor in the eyes of Turks? I wonder what Rescher had on his agenda. Buyers in Europe wanted to buy Islamic manuscripts whenever they had the budget for it, as we can see from how the collections in European libraries continued to expand throughout the 20th century. Then let's ask another question. What was the status of manuscripts in Turkey? According to the legislation that was in force during the time Rescher was active, manuscripts were considered cultural assets, and taking them abroad was prohibited. Just based on the total volume of manuscripts Rescher had sent abroad, however, little attention can be understood to have been paid to this issue in practice. In accordance with Article 5th of the Asar Atika, which means antiquities, decree of 1906, manuscripts were counted as antiquities, and their purchase and sale, as well as being taken abroad, were forbidden, pursuant to Article 26 and 27. This regulation was still in effect during the period Rescher was active. However, the definition of Asar Atika, I mean antiquities, not being very distinct here, likely did not prevent the trade of these types of manuscripts, nor their removal from the country. With a decree dated 25th August 1925, after the proclamation of the Republic, the export of any kind of valuable works with regard to calligraphy, gilded hand ornamenting, and miniature paintings, as well as of manuscripts of the treasures of language and ethnographic wares that have obtained historical value, became strictly forbidden. The same decree also requested that, in the case of a book that's held by customs officials while being sold abroad and smuggled, those responsible are to be presented to the court for punishment, and the work is to be confiscated. Also, any official who sees or hears of sales happening to foreigners or abroad are to report the circumstances to the government. Despite this, taking manuscripts outside of the country was notably easy. So under what environment was this trade possible in spite of the legislation? Let's take a look at that. Let's stop at another point first. What was Rescher looking for in Istanbul? Had Rescher come to Istanbul to collect and sell manuscripts? What reason did Rescher have for settling in Istanbul? Rescher, having received the title of doctor in the field of Oriental languages, searched for ways to grow well in his field. The trip Rescher had made to Istanbul prior to the Balkan Wars was the beginning of the chain of events that would lead to him settling in Istanbul later on. The influence that the intellectual atmosphere and libraries of Istanbul, still a center of attraction for scholarly activity in those years, exerted on the studies of Western Orientalists, certainly played a key role in this choice. Rescher, who had left Istanbul in a hurry in 1914, was able to return to the city at the age of 41, only after the Ottoman Empire had been erased from the historical scene. According to Ramazan Şeşen, he had settled in Istanbul because he loved the possibilities this city offered to him. But the motive in this attachment is related to learning. One should not forget, when Rescher left Istanbul in 1914, the Ottoman Empire continued to exist, and when he returned in 1924, the Republic of Turkey had been formed and had started radical reform activities. He witnessed the transition from Ottoman to Republic and the great transformation that had occurred. So Rescher, wanting to advance in the field of Oriental languages, appeared to be convinced that the most proper guide for this would be Ismail Sahib Efendi, and that the best place would be Istanbul, a paradise in terms of Islamic manuscripts. Sahib Efendi was unique in the Ottoman geography in regard to his mastery of Arabic. At the age of 26, Rescher attended Sahib Efendi in 1909, examining and copying manuscripts and preparing manuscript lists, in addition to publishing texts. I think one reason must be that he wanted to advance in his field. In fact, he had obtained his professorship despite having no permanent position, but a misunderstanding is found about him settling in Turkey in 1924. He is thought to have escaped from German Nazi rule and settled in Turkey because he was Jewish. When we look at his life story, however, we see that he came to Istanbul for the first time in 1909 and started spending most of his time in Ottoman lands. With the start of World War I, he was assigned to military duty and had to leave Istanbul. Once the war finished, he completed his habilitation at the University of Breslau, and in this way earned the title of Privatdozent. In 1925, he obtained the non-tenured position of professor. During this process, however, he begins to look for ways to come to Istanbul through a permanent position. He wanted to be assigned a position at the German embassy, but this was not possible. Whereupon he comes to Istanbul to teach German language at the Istanbul High School for Boys. He later taught the history of Arabic literature course at Darulfunun and continued his duty until Darulfunun was abolished. While performing these duties, however, his main task was to send manuscripts he'd been collecting from Istanbul to libraries in Europe. To me, he appears to have had more than one motivation. First of all, Sahib Efendi is here, and Istanbul is a paradise in terms of Islamic manuscripts. I'm talking about the manuscripts in the libraries of Istanbul, not manuscripts for sale. However, I think he was also conscientious toward manuscripts, which had fallen out of favor after the proclamation of the Republic. I think that if he had stayed at the Breslau University, he would have obtained tenure as professor after a certain period of time, but he didn't. But of course, things changed completely in Germany in 1933. An environment had now formed where he couldn't have returned, even if he'd wanted to. His Venia legend was stripped away in 1933. His tenure was also revoked. In other words, going back was impossible. He probably decided to become a Turkish citizen during this time. I think things also went wrong for him in Turkey as well, after a certain time. But since he could not return, he was now staying in Turkey. He maintained his life somehow. When we look at his life, he had obviously experienced more than one incident that was describable as tragic. First, his title as a professor and his authority to teach had been taken away. He later lost Sahib Efendi. His cousin committed suicide after Kristallnacht in 1938. A few years later, his mother died in the Terezin concentration camp. The only child of a rich family suddenly loses all of his assets. He kept on with his manuscript trade until his death. Although this situation is known in the relevant circles, it has not been emphasized. So how did he manage a trade of that size? How was Rescher, who came to Istanbul with a love of learning, possibly able to manage a manuscript business with this intensity? What had the state of the book trade in Istanbul been since the 1920s? While focusing on the motives that led Rescher to the manuscript trade, taking a look at the effects certain developments such as the evolution of madrasas, closure of dervish lodges, the alphabet reform, estate sales, and closure of the Darulfunun had on the manuscript trade would be useful. In the period when Rescher was actively carrying out his manuscript trade, the manuscript market was in a rich state due to these developments I listed. Rescher selected manuscripts from second-hand booksellers based on their content and physical properties and sold them abroad to libraries, second-hand booksellers, and even scholars at reasonable prices. Let's first take a look at the evolution of the madrasas. With the law of the unification of instruction, all education institutions became affiliated with the Ministry of Education, and the madrasas were closed in Turkey in 1924. The manuscripts in the madrasas, the instructors' manuscripts, and the students' manuscripts suddenly became functionless. The books that had been taught were left out of the education system. As a result of this, the printed and handwritten works that were identified as madrasa books fell into the hands of second-hand booksellers over time. However, most of these manuscripts must be said to have not possessed the qualifications that would have been of interest to Rescher. But of course, the closure of the madrasas was a development that had stimulated the market. Another supply source for the market was the closure of dervish lodges and zawiyas, which occurred in 1925. So how was the manuscript market affected by the closure of lodges? Dervish lodges and similar locales were shut down through law in 1925. A significant portion of the books and archived materials found in these places were left unclaimed, distributed, and eventually ended up on the market. Many Sufi-themed manuscripts that appear to have emerged from dervish lodges and their circles can be understood from what Rescher has told to have been found in the bazaar after this date. Some librarians, which were aware of this situation, requested manuscripts from Rescher on Sufism, especially those that had come from dervish lodges. One of the factors was that the prices were relatively affordable. In fact, German librarians requested more Turkish manuscripts from Rescher, knowing that manuscripts on history and geography were expensive, while Sufi manuscripts, being abundant in the market, were important or at least interesting due to the closure of dervish lodges. In Istanbul, you would not expect the manuscripts that had been produced in dervish lodges to attract many customers because of their physical properties. Then the price drops even more. Here I would like to show a manuscript from a dervish lodge, from a tekke, that ended up in a second-hand bookshop. One majmua of distinct importance among the Rescher manuscripts, about which nothing was previously known, was sold in 1931. According to what's understood from the record of ownership and sale, the manuscript had come from the very famous Hacı Bektaş Lodge. This lodge was closed in 1925, and the books were delivered to the General Directorate of Libraries. Some works were said to have been sold to Western libraries. This majmua must have ended up in second-hand booksellers during this time. In this majmua, I found the lost divan of Şükrü Bitlisi, the author of Selimname. And now the alphabet reform. Leaving aside special manuscripts, printed works were considered more valuable at the beginning of the 20th century. Rifat Bali said that printed books had dominated the market as a result of increased schooling, the literate population, changes in the quality of reading, development of printing techniques, and increased book printing activity since the middle of the 19th century. The second-hand booksellers, who previously had tried to cope with the distinction between printed books and manuscripts, witnessed another great change in 1928 with law on the acceptance and enforcement of the new Turkish alphabet. The use of Arabic letters was completely outlawed. The books found in printing houses were destroyed totally. Following the alphabet reform, works using the old letters suddenly became worthless and meaningless. Some of the manuscripts and printed works with old letters were burned, while others were buried or thrown in the garbage. Some were collected by state administrators, while others were sold to second-hand booksellers. Some Arabic lettered manuscripts and printed works were left at the entrance of the best second-hand bookstores bazaar in sacks at night. This anxiety continued into the 1950s. Rescher also collected manuscripts that first became discredited in the face of printed books and then turned into unwanted assets after 1928, selling them to libraries in the West. According to Arslan Kaynarda, all European Orientalists in that period came to Raif Yelkenci when they wanted to obtain works belonging to the Orient. Looking at the journey of one important manuscript that had been delivered to Berlin by Rescher's hand via Yelkenci, who had given up selling the Arabic lettered printed works after the alphabet reform, and turned completely toward manuscript works would be appropriate in this context. One of the most notable Rescher manuscripts is an early copy of the Divan of Yunus Emre. The Raif Yelkenci copy of Divan of Yunus Emre, assumed to be lost since 1931, had been copied in the 14th century, according to Abdülbaki Gölpınarlı. The fate of this copy, which is known to have passed through Yelkenci's hands, thanks to the photographs he lent to Gölpınarlı, remained unknown for 90 years. The irregularity and lack of clarity caused issues in studies on Yunus Emre, and people wondered where the copy was for years. It was sold to Berlin by Rescher. He must have received this manuscript from Raif Yelkenci. Another development that motivated the manuscript market were the estate sales of the library owners who had died during Ottoman Empire's transition to the Republic, especially after the alphabet reform. For example, a professor dies, his estate is being put up for sale. The whole collection ends up in a second-hand bookstore. Estate sales are occurring, and Rescher is also collecting manuscripts from these. I've seen Rescher manuscripts that were selected probably from estate sales. According to a recounting from 1935, the bazaar always had 20 auctioneers, and the estates of the deceased were auctioned at the bazaar. According to Muhammed Tatlısu, the libraries that had been dispersed with the passing of generations had diversified the quality of the book circulation. An evaluation from Suat Dervish is also significant in this regard. One of the significant transformations in the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Republic was experienced in the residences. The Republican generation went from mansions to apartments, and the books from the mansions ended up with the second-hand booksellers, as no room remained for the ancestral libraries in the shrunken living spaces. Although rare, some sold their books while still alive. When estates ended up irregularly in second-hand booksellers, or were bought directly, they would be in great demand among the bibliophiles in the bazaar. We cannot know whether Rescher himself participated in the auctions. However, some manuscripts are found among those sold to the libraries that are understood to have been selected from estates. Some of the manuscripts that had changed hands in estate sales should have passed into Rescher's hands. The tale of one very valuable manuscript Rescher sold to the Berlin State Library and that had come from Yanko Hochi's estate is remarkable in this context. This manuscript is the only known copy of the verse prose Fethname of Sultan Mehmed I by Kıvami. Based on the seals of Bayezid II and Fatih Sultan Mehmed, the manuscript can be said with certainty to have come from the palace. This copy was mentioned in the Defter Atufi had prepared for the library of Bayezid II, and we can see Atufi's record on the manuscript. Franz Babinger stated that this manuscript had come from the library of Yanko Hochi. Hochi Bey was well known for his library. His library had been acquired by Berlin State Library in 1917 and transferred to the German embassy in Istanbul. However, due to the armistice, the transfer process later occurred through the Dutch embassy. Based on the seals that took place later in Istanbul, however, some of Hochi's books are understood to have remained in Istanbul and been sold over time. Raif Yelkenci told Babinger that Fethname had been sold to Germany, although Hochi Bey had previously told Ali Emiri Efendi that he had given this manuscript as a gift to the former American ambassador. Babinger thought that, after Hochi's death, his books occasionally came to second-hand booksellers, and that Rıza Nasrullah, a bookseller, had sold Fethname to Germany. According to the Berlin State Library's acquisition journal, however, Rescher was the one who sold Fethname to the library. In our opinion, this situation is related to Rescher having occasionally acted as a broker. So, what about Saib Efendi's support? I will show two images, one on the right and one on the left. According to the document given from the Ottoman Grand Vizier's office in 1911, Rescher had obtained permission to examine and copy antiquities in the Topkapı Palace Library. According to another document given by Ottoman Minister of Education in 1913, the local administration in Bursa on that date requested showing the convenience Rescher required for examining the old books. These are official documents. The doors had been opened. Here, Rescher received support from the German embassy and wrote about this in one of his articles. I think he also used Said Efendi's influence. Rescher's ability to conduct the manuscript trade as easily as he did has raised questions. According to me, one of the most significant matters that made Rescher's trade possible was that he had the backing of Said Efendi. Rescher did not leave Said Efendi's side when he started selling manuscripts. Said Efendi was aware of Rescher's manuscript trade. I'm of the opinion that Rescher received Said Efendi's support in his manuscript trade just as he had in his works and in places he worked. I have some documents and memoirs to support this claim. I think the most intense period of Rescher's trade was 1924 and 36. We know that Rescher never left Said Efendi's side during these years. Here I must absolutely say this about the manuscripts Rescher had sent. Rescher did not just pick up and send the manuscripts. He also offered his expertise on the manuscripts he sent. He would first examine a manuscript and then determine what texts were in it. He would note its features and whether it was an autograph or a unique copy. He would also note in which catalog he had seen a copy of this manuscript. The complaints about Rescher coming to Said Efendi's site with many manuscripts in his arms and asking endless questions about them indicate that at least some of the manuscripts Rescher asked about were manuscripts that he traded. It's clear that Rescher merely intended to secure information for the benefit of future users, catalogers, or buyers of these manuscripts. We know that he benefited greatly from Said Efendi while writing and translating his books. Here I will show you a manuscript that we know passed through the hands of Said Efendi. Müyessiretul Ulum is considered the first grammar book in the native language of Western Turkish and was written by Kadri from Bergama in 1530. According to Güler Gülseven, the work gives the grammar of Western Turkish very systematically. This copy had been left to Said Efendi to be shown to interested parties, and Mehmet Tahir Efendi bought the copy. Tahir Efendi later showed this manuscript to those who wanted it and would even entrust it to them. The work was first introduced by Kazım Nami, while the second article had been written by Mehmet Tahir. The last introductory article had been written by Fuat Köprülü. During this process, copies were made by Kilisli Rifat Bilge and Fuat Köprülü. According to what Köprülü had reported, Tahir Efendi left the manuscript again with Said Efendi to show those who were interested, namely in order to mediate its sale. This manuscript was sold to Berlin by Rescher. Looking at the price, we can assume that both the seller and the buyer are aware of the importance of the manuscript during the sale. Now I will show some precious Rescher manuscripts and finish the presentation with a general evaluation and some questions, if you don't mind. From the letters I saw in Munich and Prague, I understand that Rescher has sent letters with similar content to libraries in 1924, asking if they would consider purchasing oriental manuscripts. As a result, there are two issues here. Despite Rescher having sold 8 manuscripts to the Berlin State Library in 1913 and 14, first of all, we don't know what the purpose for selling these manuscripts was. And second of all, the war had interrupted things. Even if a trade had been about to start, it was postponed for 10 years. Okay, thank you. Therefore, saying that his manuscript trade started in 1924 would be more accurate. Despite being unable to access the correspondence between Rescher and the Berlin State Library, we were able to learn some details about Rescher's manuscript sales process from the archives in Leipzig, Prague, and Munich. According to this, Rescher would send the manuscripts to the library accompanied by a price list, and the library officials would make the final decision on whether or not to buy the manuscripts. Manuscripts were sent to the libraries mainly by post. The library would convert the prices from Turkish lira to the country's currency. The payments for the manuscripts were sent to the Galata branch, a district in Istanbul, of the Deutsche Bank. Rescher was not a manuscript collector. He bought manuscripts in order to immediately sell them, but he may also be assessed as a manuscript dealer in this aspect. In one of his letters, Rescher states that he would be unable to change the price in any way because he did not own the manuscripts himself. According to Klaus Peter Hase, Rescher sold the manuscripts of the booksellers on commission in the 1960s. Therefore, we can say that Rescher sold the manuscripts on behalf of second-hand booksellers and received commissions from these sales. Rescher is also understood to have sold manuscripts on his own behalf. He prioritizes the manuscripts that he finds important in terms of content rather than physical features. In other words, I think he looks at the content, but he also looks at the physical characteristics. Of course, price should be also a criterion for him. He didn't send manuscripts that were easily found everywhere in his time or that were widely read among the people. Lost works, unique works, autograph copies, and palace manuscripts are included among the manuscripts he sent. Many of the manuscripts he sold bear his traces. Most of the time, he had written down the necessary information about the manuscript and its content with a pencil and referred to other copies of the manuscript. Sometimes he had also sent gift manuscripts. I think he was trying to set up a collection in every library he dealt with. According to my findings thus far, he prioritized Turkish manuscripts. Rescher must have had additional reasons for sending manuscripts abroad. I would like to note one point that caught my attention in this regard. He lived in Ankara for a certain period of time. He wrote the following in the introduction to a book he published in those years. Quote, "In Ankara, there is no publications prepared by the Orientalists or manuscripts. Absolutely nothing. It's not possible for a scholar to study here. What will you study with?" Unquote. He then sold his library of approximately 5,000 books to the first faculty established in Ankara. From this perspective, I find the fact that he left his own books in Ankara to be very revealing. I think one could assess this as a service. In the West, an Orientalist also needs manuscripts to study. I wonder if he'd formed such an equation in his mind, namely sending manuscripts to the West and bringing publications from the West. Apart from his interest in written materials, our opinion is that while on the one hand he had provided the Orientalists with the materials they would study, on the other hand, he had been attempting to permanently preserve these works that had fallen out of favor. By the way, the fees Rescher requested were quite reasonable. This was included in Leipzig University Library's annual reports. I think I can leave things here. Thank you so much.